a follow-up to a previous session that we held a few weeks back that covered all of Teams, kind of in a very broad stroke, very high level, and then these subsequent webinars that we wanted to focus in on specific areas of that presentation. And of course, we wanted to start with governance. Governance is one of the things that we recommend before you deploy Teams, as you look at some of the topics that we're going to cover here today, and think about how you want to deploy it, the things you want to have in place, control the deployment of Teams, such as naming conventions, expirations, some of the basic policies you want to get in place before you deploy it, and lead from there. Okay, Don. So one of the things we want to cover is, what are your decision points when you're going to deploy Teams? So does your organization require specific naming conventions for Teams? Do team creators need the ability to assign organization-specific classifications? Do you need to restrict the ability to add guests or teams on a per-team basis? So you may want to lock down adding guests to teams at an organizational level and then control that with an approval process, and you can do that. Does your organization require limiting who can create the teams? So do you want a process where you have an approver or IT creates the teams to begin with? And that's the most typical approach, is companies will lock it down until they put some governance in place and maybe some of the naming convention policies and a form that can do some validation, and then they kind of turn it over to the end users now that they have the governance and requirements in place that they need to follow. Okay, Don. So once you kind of look at those things, the next step is document your requirements for team creation, naming, classification, guest access, and then plan to implement these requirements as part of your team's rollout. Communicate and publish those policies and inform team users of the behaviors that they can expect once you start rolling out Teams, either through communications, training sessions, and things like that. Okay, Don. So the goal for this session is why are we covering this? So we really want to focus on, in the early deployment or pre-deployment of Teams, is some of the governance we recommend or as best practices to get in place as you begin to roll this out in your organization. And it's not saying that if you've already rolled out Teams, you can't put these in place. You can absolutely put these in place after the fact. It would just require a little more communication with end users if they're already experiencing a certain behavior. If you're going to implement governance after the fact, then it turns into working more with end users and communicating that. Okay. So why are we covering this right now? In this slide, if you were in the previous sessions, you're familiar with the slide. So, over 12 million new teams, and I think that's over 20 million at this point, I think, when I last looked, in the last few weeks have been added to Microsoft Teams. They have far surpassed 44 million daily logins a day in Teams now. And then, as we saw there, we put a little thing there that coronavirus is now driving Teams adoption very rapidly. So looking at that, a lot of IT departments are getting pressure from management and in the business now that they're working remotely. That timeline that they may have thought they had were 2 or 3 months to deploy. Now businesses are asking, can we deploy this in sometimes as little as 1 to 2 weeks, right? So it's a very rapid deployment, with trying to at least get some of that governance in place before you do it as much as possible. And like I said, if you've already turned Teams on, you may already be experiencing the sprawl of people, creating teams. If you haven't turned that off, naming conventions, things like that. So, and then the governance before implementation, we really recommend, if you have the time to put some governance in place and plan that out before you deploy it. It helps the deployment, education of users, and things like that, and helps you control that in the beginning. But like I said, if you've already got Teams out and it's out there, you can implement some of these after the fact. It's just a different approach. And then some of the security pieces were there. But primarily in this one, we're going to focus on that governance block. Okay, Don. And with that, I will turn this over to Don Dahlberg, and he will lead you through the rest of the presentation.
Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Hopefully well. Um, yeah. So we're going to move on to the Teams deployment aspect of this, which is one of the things that we sort of always recommend if you have the time. Obviously, if you're planning to deploy Teams and you have the time to put some governance in place, one of the first things that you're going to have to think about is how do you deploy, how do you roll it out to your organization? And there's a couple of different aspects on that, which is how do you roll out the desktop client to everybody on their workstation so that they can use the client, and then some of the creation request pieces that Chris was previously talking about. So with the desktop client, there's several different ways that you can roll that out. You can use SCCM or WSUS. Those are common ways that organizations roll packages or applications out to workstations, so you can certainly do that. Teams application, the desktop client now comes with O365 Pro Plus if you're on version 1902 or above. So you may have already experienced, if you've upgraded users to a newer version of Pro Plus, that the Teams desktop client is already there. And if you haven't rolled out Teams yet, you may be already getting some questions like, what is this Teams thing and how do I use it and why isn't it logging in, et cetera, et cetera. But it's now included in Pro Plus. You can roll it out with Intune on your desktop AD joined devices as well. You can roll that out with a GPO. You can roll that out with PowerShell or logon scripts as well. And there's some deployment methods for VDI as well. We're not going to get necessarily into that today, but just letting you know that there are some things to think about there when you're rolling out to desktop clients, how you would do that and sort of phase that or in parallel with how you're actually going to roll out the teams themselves to your users in a pilot group or then out to the larger organization.
Yeah, and real quick is outside of the Office 365 Pro Plus 1902, if your organization is in a what we call a Teams Islands mode today, there is an option, unless it's been turned off, that if you're in Islands mode and they're using Skype for Business, there's a checkbox in the admin portal that says if you're in Islands mode, download Teams in the background for users, and that's on by default if you're in Islands mode and you haven't turned it off. So in some cases, these users will have this installed, they may not even know it. So unless you've turned that off, and depending on the migration mode, but if you're in Islands mode, by default that is on. So some of your users may already have it, and have it in the background.
Yeah, yeah, correct. And then that moves on to that. Actually, there's a touching point on the next thing. There is group policy for Teams where you can prevent Teams from auto launching. And the reason you may want to do that is just for the reasons that we've sort of mentioned, that that either the application can be downloaded in the background or it may have been included with Pro Plus and you're not quite ready for that yet. So you can actually roll out a GPO to prevent the client from actually being used or deploying, so that the users don't know that it's there and they're not they're not creating support tickets or things like that when you're not really ready for it. So that's kind of helpful, and when you're trying to roll it out, you can kind of control that application rollout when for when you're ready to actually roll it out to people. And then onto the Teams creation process. Chris sort of mentioned it and discussed it. Maybe you have or you haven't, but how to limit Teams creation. It's typically done, and again, it's a decision process. Who can create the teams? Is it going to be IT? Is it going to be a support desk? And deciding who that's going to be, and then sort of implementing that. It's typically implemented with a security group, and a certain group of people only have the ability to do that. You do need some specific licensing in place to actually do that process. And then thinking about, again, the naming policies, and why you would want to do that, and wrapping some expiration around the governance piece of this, to think about it ahead of time if you have the opportunity to do so. And There's a link here also about groups limitations, what you can and can't do with groups. We may get into that in another slide a little bit later. But the other piece of this is how do users request a team? Once you've decided who can create a team, how are they going to do that? Is it just going to simply be an email that's sent to the support desk? Is it going to be a form that somebody fills out on a SharePoint site? Or do you want to completely automate that with a flow and some automation in the background that checks for the naming policy to see if it matches, and then either allows or disallows the creation of that team based on naming policy and the proper information, proper owner has been assigned, etc. So those are some things that we definitely recommend you can put some thought around before you roll it out. And again, like Chris said, even if you haven't done that yet, you can still put these things in place and get some governance around it and try to wrangle it if you're kind of in that position already.
Yeah. So what we've done at some organizations is created a form that does a validation, because if some of you are using Teams today, you may have experienced it or not, but Teams will allow you to create two teams with the same name, and it's happened. So with the form we've assisted some organizations build is in the form it does a validation check into your directory. Does this team name already exist? And if it does, it comes back and it recommends a different name, and they can accept it or move on. And then as long as it meets all the validation points at the very end of it, it automatically creates a team, notifies IT that it's done. But if there's some things in there, like some organizations will lock down the ability for guest access, and in that form you may say, do you require guest access to your team site? And if they do, then it routes for approval rather than automatic approving. It routes it to security. Security contacts us as, why do you need guest access? And then they can approve it on an individual basis. So you do still, even with an automated form, have the ability to put some controls in that automation piece.
Great point. Yep. So the next piece to think about here when it comes to governance, which it usually comes up, which is great. We've wrapped some governance around it, but now what we're trying to think about is we're rolling it out. How do we know people are using it? How do we monitor what's going on? And another piece of this that usually comes up is how do we make sure everybody's using it? We want everybody to use this product. This is what we're rolling out. We don't want people to use another service such as Zoom or something like that. We want them to use this. Let's get how do we get them to adopt this product? So there's a couple of just a couple touching points on the monitoring aspect. In the Teams Admin Center, you can get some reports on usage, user activity, device usage, live event usage, and PST calling information. And then along with that, with the adoption piece of that, what we recommend as a starting point for getting users involved in how to use the product. One of the big things that comes up is training. We don't have the personnel to train people. We don't have the material to train people. So Microsoft has offered a way. It's a full-blown, fully functioning learning portal that actually covers the entire Office suite and services in O365. But specifically, they provide you videos, walkthroughs, tutorials, etc., right there in your environment for your users to go to and learn about it, and you can just direct them there and get them started. So it's a really fantastic tool to get people involved and get that adoption going, so that when you're rolling it out, that people are kind of using the product that you want them to use. There are some other things that you can do and put together more material on your own, etc. This is just a great starting point to get there. And if you have SharePoint Online, it's very easy to deploy this. It's a few simple mouse clicks, really. It's great, and within a few minutes or a few hours, depending on some of the setup, you've got a full functioning portal to walk your users through, in this case, Teams adoption and how to use it. So here we're going to get a little bit into the naming policy and what you can do there. The naming group naming policy is just really a way to enforce a consistent naming strategy for groups that are created by users, or if it's created through your automated process. And the naming policy can cover a few things. It can help you identify what the function of the group should be, who should be in it. Perhaps geographic region makes sense in your organization, or who created the group. And it helps also organize all of your teams into the address book. And you can also use the policy to block specific words that you don't want to be used for group names or aliases. And this is just really let's touch on the second thing. The naming policy also is actually applied to groups that are created across all the workloads in O365. So Outlook, Teams, SharePoint, Planner, Yammer. So this policy would cover any group that's created for any of those services, whether it be Teams or otherwise. And it gets applied to both the group name and the alias. So really handy way, as Chris mentioned, this is how you're going to lock down the ability for people to duplicate teams in your organization, because it will allow you to, or your users, it will allow a duplicate named team out there, which causes a lot of confusion, and people don't know where to go. I thought my document was in this one, that one, etc. So this is one of the really the first places to start with governance in locking down some control there. Also, point of note, this only applies to O365 groups. It does not apply to Exchange distribution groups. That's a whole different scenario or policy for those. But this is just a few screenshots to show you also where that's at in the O365 group management in the admin portal, where you go to the naming policy. You can enable custom block words. You can actually download a CSV of the block words, add or remove terms, upload a CSV, and then you can get into, do you want a prefix on the name of the team? Maybe it's, if you're doing it by geographic region, STL-ERP project, something to that effect, as an example. So this is just to give you an idea where that's at in the admin portal. Some of the other things that we're going to get into a little bit here that you can put some governance around. One of the big things that comes up is, archiving. Can we archive teams? And now you can do that. And archiving covers, in a nutshell, what happens on the back end is that the team activity ceases. Membership can still be edited on a team. Channels are archived. And you can choose to either set the SharePoint site underneath Teams to read only, or leave it still editable, for lack of a better term. And what we always recommend, and it's recommended by Microsoft as well, is that you always implement an archiving policy before deleting anything. To give users or owners a chance to say, no, I need that back, that type of thing. Once you go into a deletion of a team, it's more difficult to get it back because it deletes the O365 group. It goes into a 30-day soft delete. And about the only way you can get that back is restore it with PowerShell and wait up to 24 hours to get it back. So what you don't want to do is delete things without at least archiving them and giving people a chance to get that data back. You can set some expiration policies on these as well, which is something that we always recommend. It's not on by default, but this gets into, this is really handled via an O365 group expiration policy. And again, this gets down to, ownership. When you're creating them, you certainly want to define owner on teams. That way that if you're going to put an expiration policy in place, an owner is going to get notified 30 days out from expiration, 15, and then 1 day, that this is going to go away if we have an expiration policy on it. Do you still need it? And if it goes into expiration, then it goes into soft delete for 30 days. And it also works hand in hand with retention policies as well. just a little something to note here when we say, you know, assign an owner to a team. A good thing to think about is maybe you assign two, because what will happen if you have expiration policies in place is maybe somebody's on vacation and they're getting this reminder, but they're not responding to it. So just something to think about it from a governance perspective, that maybe every team that's created is you're gonna require two owners. That way there's always a backup in case you have expiration policies in place. Auto renewal, it's automatically on there if you've deployed a O365 group expiration policy. So this is a really good feature here, because what it allows you is you're not going to accidentally get something expired here, because there's some features built into SharePoint, Outlook, and Teams that trigger an auto renewal, and it will never go into expiration. So that's, as an example, the SharePoint site underneath, if somebody uploads a file, if it's, say, a team hasn't been used in 3 months and then somebody goes and uploads one file, boom, that just triggers the auto renewal and it won't go into expiration, archiving, or be deleted. Retention is something that they've just recently added. Well, not maybe the last 3 or 4 months, I suppose. Teams conversations now fall under retention policies. As some of you may or may not know, the Teams chat is persistent by default, but then you can set some policies around that. Really, that covers a few things. Preserve the chat and do nothing. Preserve and delete, or just simply delete. Okay, but those retention policies work hand in hand with the expiration for the chat portions of Teams.
One thing of important note there that Don was covering about the chat, because we've had some organizations ask, hey, we don't want to keep any of that. We don't want any history. Today, the limitation is it's at least for 24 hours. So there's no way to turn it off where it's not, because it is persistent. So it keeps a history. There's no way for it not to keep that. The least amount of time that you can put it in for is 24 hours. So if you put it, your retention policy says we don't keep the persistent chat history, it's there for at least 24 hours. So you just need to be aware of that, is you can't turn it off where it doesn't ever keep it, but you can get it to where it's just only 24 hours. So a single day. So it'll be there for 24 hours and then it'll delete off. So. Yeah.
We should probably add that to the slide too, but good point. The other thing to point here is we all know that SharePoint is underneath Teams, and these retention policies only apply to the chat functionality in Teams. If you're looking to do some retention policies around the documentation or content in SharePoint or OneDrive, those are separately set in retention policies in OneDrive or SharePoint. A little bit more information on the expiration policy and sort of where to go and how that works. It's somewhat self-explanatory, but it's a way to clean up unused groups. What we found, and you may be finding this yourself, perhaps you haven't put any governance in place around who can create a team, and your users have created a lot of teams. In fact, it's still a thing. If you haven't put any governance in place, every user in your organization can create 250 of these. So if you multiply that by the amount of users you have in your organization, you can kind of see how it can get out of control. So the expiration is just really a way to clean up unused ones. Perhaps people are rolling out teams or for projects, the HR team or the finance team. They have a team for a new ERP system and a new financial system, etc. This is just a good way to limit that and control that, so that you can keep your organization sort of cleaned up, the environment cleaned up. So really, it's removing inactive groups from the system and making things cleaner. When a group expires, all of its services, the mailbox, planner, SharePoint, all of that they also go away. They are deleted. When a group is expired, it's soft deleted, which means it can be recovered up to 30 days. And we sort of mentioned that earlier. When it goes into deletion, that it's more difficult to actually recover it. So to think about that. Groups that are actively used, we touched upon this, they're renewed automatically. And they're, again, what we have pointed out here with a little bit more in depth is some of the actions that take place in each of those three services that will trigger an auto renewal. And then here's some screenshots in the portal where you go into the expiration and create the policy on the O365 group. Set the lifetime email contact for groups with no owners. That's a good one there, because you may find that the owner is no longer available in the organization. They've retired, they've moved on to someplace else. So there's another contact that can be contacted, perhaps an administrative contact, putting the policy in place. For auditing monitoring, we touched upon this a little bit earlier, but it's, like we mentioned earlier, when you're rolling this out, it's very important to know how users are using it and what their experience is. You want everybody to use the product that you're rolling out. So the usage reports can help you understand, usage patterns, some feedback, give you insights to inform your wider rollout and where to prioritize training and communication efforts. And the usage report gives you an overview of activity in teams, including the total active users, the channels, the number of active users, and channels, guests, and messages in each team. And this is just sort of a screenshot of where you can see this in the analytics and reports section for teams. And it's a really great place to start when you're rolling this out, to just get an idea of where you're at and where you're trying to get to. The activity report gives you insight into how many people communicate through one-on-one calls, channel messages, private chat messages, so you can get a little bit more granular and in-depth into what might be going on there. Are people using it more just for IM, or are they using it for private chats, or are they using Teams for group chats, one-on-one calls? This gives you a sense of, for instance, if you're using this as a replacement for Skype, are they kind of using it for those same functionality? And you get a little bit more insight into that.
Yeah, and is where the first screen there was around the team as a whole. This one drills down into the individual users. So then you can look at how individuals are actually using it. So you can look at a team site as a whole, and then you can break down into individuals and users. How are users using it, and stuff like that. So.
The device usage report gives you some information on how users are connecting to Teams. How many people are using Teams, for instance, on their mobile devices when on the go. And this is, again, to Chris's point, this is, per user to get a little bit of idea. Are they using it on their Windows machine? Are they using it on a mobile device? Gives you some insight onto where people are using it the most. Commonly, you would see this ticked up on everybody on their Windows machine if they're using it there. But this is just good to know if somebody's having some poor experience, but you go in here and look and see that they're using it mostly on their mobile device. That might give you some idea on where to troubleshoot those issues. So this is a few screenshots just to give you an idea how to get to the some of the management of Teams in the portal, in Teams admin portal. And the first and foremost thing to go to is just manage Teams. This gives you an idea of how many you have, what they're named, how many channels have been created, how many members, how many owners, are there guests part of this team, is it private or public, and whether it's active or inactive. So that's just give you an idea of where to go right straight. Some of you may or may not even have seen the admin portal and where you can manage most of these things. So this is just a quick screenshot to get you to that location and give you an idea where you can look at it. Some people might go, well, I know we have some, I just don't even know where to go find them. So this is a good place to get you started.
Yeah, and that has actually happened. We've gone into clients who've had teams out for a while, and they're like, okay, now we want to actually start deploying this and then we take them in there, and they're like, they already have 350 teams created, and they had no idea. So it's it's a great place to look, and in there it'll show you you can sort by no owners, and you can see like in one of those in that screenshot it had Aaron
I'll
said,
go back. Yep.
yeah, the second one had, trying, it says, hey, this one doesn't have an owner. So you can quickly look in here and see, is it private, public? Is it inactive? Is it archived, active, stuff like that. So you can, and you can actually select and delete teams from here, edit, do some things in here, or archive it. But yeah, this gives you that kind of overall view within your Teams management portal.
And then this screenshot just gives you a little bit of an idea of what else is involved in the admin portal and other things that you can do there, which is kind of just really where you're really controlling the service itself. And aside from that, you can control messaging policies, the Teams apps, some voice administration, policy packages, analytics and reports, which just went through for the user adoption and the monitoring pieces. And then it gets into some things like org-wide settings, which you're going to want to look at when you're deciding to roll this out, or if you already have and now you're sort of deciding, well, now let's put some governance around that. Where this is where you can make some setting changes for external access, guest access, settings regarding just the Teams settings themselves, Teams upgrade, which is what Chris was talking about earlier about islands modes. We're not going to necessarily get into that too deep on this presentation, but there's, I think, 5 different modes now. Holidays.
Yeah, it's important to know that each one of those Teams upgrade affects your deployment and how, if you have Skype for Business today, how they interact. And which one is the primary and stuff like that. And the reason we included this in here is out of the box, most of these policies are pretty much what most organizations keep the standard. But if you're getting into planning and rolling it out, it's important to at least get familiar with the portal and look at these policy things, because you may want to look at all those meeting settings and then go to the organization and say, here's the options that we have available for meeting policy things, and go to, cover it with security and legal and things, and just make sure that you show them what's available, what's turned on by default, and they may be okay with it, but at least you presented it to them and they've approved it and said, yeah, all those settings are fine. Or they may say, oh, well, you know what, let's, one of these is guest access. It may be turned on by default. They may say, we want to turn that off, or external access. And we will cover, it's important that we will cover the difference between external access and guest access. So we do get a lot of confusion around those two and what each of those means and does within your organization and within Teams specifically. But yeah, so we wanted to make sure that you at least see what's available. If you haven't seen the admin portal, if you're thinking about rolling this out, is you do have all these settings available, and you can view them and see what the default policies are set up.
Yeah. And like Chris said, most of these policies by default are going to be fine for most organizations. But yeah, get in and take a look. And then that can help you decide if you need to make any changes from the defaults. Also, there's some section in here. It's in the other screenshot next to it is meetings, different meeting policies. An example of that would be, let's say you only want a certain group of people to not be able to allow request control, for instance, to be able to use that. You can create a separate policy for that and put those people in that. That's just an example of something that you can control there. But default ones are usually fine for most organizations. But here's where you get to it. So as Chris mentioned, we did want to mention this. This is kind of a big one. This comes up a lot when we're talking to organizations about Teams deployments. And, we notice or see that a lot of people use these terms interchangeably, not really necessarily understanding what the difference is between the two. So what we kind of wanted to point out here is there is a difference between guest access and external access in Teams. Guest access refers to access to a team that has been created, and it's a collaboration within that team. So you've set up a team, you have 4 internal people, and you've allowed an external person into that team only to collaborate on documentation, to have meetings, to have calls, to chat, etc. That's what typically guest access is referred to. It's a user to team scenario or relationship, and they can work on documents with you within that team. They can chat, have calls, they can do video, and that's enabled in the Teams admin portal that we just looked at. External access is slightly different. This is really access to a domain or organization, and it's more of a user-to-user relationship. And what that means is you're just allowing any external users to collaborate with any of your internal users, whether they're in a team or not. They can, IM or chat with you. They can have calls with you. They can do video. They don't have specific access to a team that has been created or a channel that's been created within a team. And that is on by default, but can be scoped to specific domains. For instance, let's say you want to allow external access from a company that you work with all the time, and you just want to be able to do IM and chat with those people, etc. You can scope that to specific domains, but everybody else outside of your organization would not be able to do that. So
Yeah.
you can see there's kind of a clear difference between the two and what sort of functionality that you get there.
And,
Go ahead,
and
Chris.
if you've used Skype for Business in the past or Teams or something, you're familiar with the term of federation, right? This terminology used for this has kind of changed over the years. Now it's called external access. But essentially, what in an example of this be is you're in your Skype for Business or Teams client today, and you work with an external vendor, and you want to be able to communicate with them. They have Teams or Skype for Business as well, and you want to see their presence and you want to add them to your address book and be able to open and communicate with them within your Skype for Business or Teams client. That's what external access is, and by default it's on, so you could add external vendors or users that use Teams or Skype into your client. You can see their presence, and then you can chat with them within your client. You can call them, do things like that. The options you have in there is you can, by default it's on, but you can either exclude or include. So what that means is you can create an allow only list and add them in the, or you can allow everyone except block these. So you have the option of it's open to everybody, or it's open to everyone except for these domains. We're going to block those, or it's block everyone except for these domains. So you have those options. And what you do in here does not affect what you can do within a team. So you may block them, you may block all domains for external access as far as the communication with the client, but you can invite them as a guest into a team to work on a project. So what you do in external access does not affect what you can do within guest access. So just to make sure that, that's kind of what we want to make sure we covered here, is because that's where some of the confusion comes in is, well, if I block them here, does that mean that I can't join, invite them to work in a project in a team? Absolutely not. That just means if you block external access, you can't add them as a contact. You can't communicate within your Teams or Skype for Business client, but you can invite them and work with them within a team that you invite them.
And I see, I got an echo going on here. I see Rob is got a question regarding this. So Rob, how about we jump through the next couple slides and then we'll circle back on that, because that's related to what we're talking about right now. Is that
okay? Sure, no problem.
We'll do that. Okay.
Surprised I have a question, right?
No, not at all. So we're going to get into a little bit on the security piece of this. Again, as Chris mentioned, we're going to do another presentation later on down the road that gets more into security versus governance, but it's just worth mentioning the pieces, these pieces, because they kind of, it's ambiguous. It's a little bit of it's a little bit of security, a little bit of governance. Sharing, what does guest access sharing do? And so, there are some limitations of what a guest, so if people go, well, guest access, they're going to have access to everything. No, that is actually not the case. There are certainly limitations around guest access in Teams, and these are just a few of them. They're not going to have access to OneDrive for Business. They're not going to be able to search for people outside of the team if they've been invited to a team as a guest. They can't search for other users in your organization. They're not going to get the calendar, scheduled meetings, or meeting details type scenario within that you would normally get in a federated or external access type scenario. There's no PSTN calling. There's no access to your organization chart. They can't create or revise a team. They can't browse for a team, any other team in your organization. They simply have access to the one that they've been given access to. And they can't upload files to a person-to-person chat. It's just an example of the limitations of guest access. And then over here in this chart, we have a little bit of a, what is something, a feature that, a comparison between external access versus guest access. And again, I touched upon this one. For instance, a user can search for users across external tenants. If you have external access turned on, they can search for somebody else in your organization and initiate a chat. If they are a guest, they cannot do that. That's just not allowed in a guest access scenario. Just an example of that. So can you block users? Yes, you can block a guest user, but you can't block a federated or external access user. And again, Chris is pointing out here in the chat, Rob, does some of this slide help with your question, or do we still need to address that at the end?
Still trying to wrap my head around it.
Okay, fine. Well, we only got 3 slides left, so we're going to have some time for questions. So this is just to give you an idea of what guest access means and what the limitations are and the feature comparison between the two. Upcoming webinar, which we sort of touched upon here, we'll cover a little bit more on the sharing, get a little bit more in depth on that. We're going to get into some things like DLP, which is data loss prevention, which is security around documentation and information. Labels, if you want to use classification labels for your teams and the documentation within it. And information barriers, which is another security feature that's available now in Teams. Just letting you know that these sort of features work hand in hand with Teams, can be implemented with Teams, and give you some more security around Teams if you're needing even more security when you're thinking about your decisions that you're trying to make. Real quick on this slide here is just giving you an overview of in the admin portal for Teams what you have control over, that we gave you some screenshots regarding. You're going to have access to your organization settings for controlling apps within Teams, external access, guest access, how to control notifications and feeds, email integration, file sharing, devices, and the coexistence, which is the islands modes that Chris and I were referring to earlier. Access to teams and channel policies. There's default policies, which again will work for most organizations, but then you can create your own. Messaging policies that control chat and messaging features within Teams. Again, the default's probably fine, but it's worth looking at if you feel like you need to put some more control around that. You can also then control some apps, bots, and connectors features within Teams, tabs, where you're using the pin services or connectors to either third-party applications or tools. Slack would be a good example of that. You can connect Slack to Teams. Controlling chats with bots, task sharing, privacy and access, and where your activity reports are. And then meeting policies, which we sort of covered a little bit. Also, you can control how your invitations look, and you can get in a little bit into the call quality piece of it with QoS on the meetings. That's quality of service, a little bit of a networking geeky type stuff there, but in some organizations with maybe not enough bandwidth, that's some place where you can control that a little bit.
And where that's really important is when you move into the video conferencing or enterprise voice pieces of it, right? That's where you really want to start focusing on QoS, and it depends on how much bandwidth you have available inside your company, and then internal to external is if you start seeing quality issues on calls or video conferencing, is to get your network team involved, and we were doing it ahead of time, but working with them to put some, and Microsoft does define some very specific quality of service settings and things that you can configure within your network.
And yeah, and then that sort of includes our governance webinar for today. And then I guess we can circle back around on Rob's questions. I don't know if those got actually answered or not. Trying to go back through the chat.
Yeah,
so maybe just throw that back out at us, Rob, about,
yeah.
I see you threw out another one about inviting someone to share SharePoint files as an external user. So as you know, within SharePoint, outside of Teams, you can still share files with people externally, and that would be, and when we say externally, what we really mean is guest, right? You're adding them as a guest to your SharePoint team site, and they would be a guest in that team site.
That's what I expected. So I guess, and this may not be a case for very many people in the presentation, but the challenge that we're facing is we have two organizations that have literally can be on the same floor working with each other, and one person is a BJC person, another person is a WashU person, and right, so they each have their own tenants, but they need to share information, and so what is that experience like within Teams? And what we're finding is it's pretty confusing, right? If unless they kind of understand the rules of how to do that, right? And part of that is, are they an external person or a guest person? And they can be both, and within Teams, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, you know, I guess what I'm looking for is, as you guys are doing these consulting engagements, how do you help people understand that? I mean, are there infographics you use? Are there some best practices used around that?
Yes, we do. And so, and you're right, is it's important to understand that there is access and then there's authentication, right? So I've set up external access, which means I can communicate with them. But if you just drop a link into that IM with an external user, but they don't have authentication or to that document, right, to authenticate, they're not going to get access to it. So that's where the adding them as a guest and then authorizing them to access that information within a team, or before, even with outside of Teams, like Don was saying, within SharePoint, a SharePoint site, you can add guest, send guest invitations where they now have access and are authorized to view documents. So it's helping them understand, the difference between the two and how to work with those. So in your scenario too, you may run into where, let's say, WashU's open federated and we can do all these things, but BJC's locking it down. That can confuse users too, because they're like, well, they can get to my stuff, but I can't get to theirs. So what's going on? It's understanding and working with both organizations to understand what BJC may have set up is different than what WashU has set up, and communicate those, and help users understand, here's the rules for engagement between these two companies. You are allowed to do this with them and they're allowed to do this, but not these things. And here's how you get around that is, invite them to a guest and stuff like that. But absolutely, we help go in and solve problems like that. And it's helping understanding what you have set on both sides, and then what that communication path is going to look like going both ways.
Yeah. And go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think another thing that might be helpful in your situation, Rob, is maybe it's easier to explain to the users that external access is kind of, and Chris alluded to it earlier in the presentation, but that's kind of like a one-to-one for Skype for Business, right? Mm-hmm. If you're using Skype for Business and you're chatting with somebody outside the organization, that's external access. You're having a video call with them, external access. Mm-hmm. You've set up a meeting with them, external access. But if they need access to actually content within a team that has been created, or a channel and documentation with inside of that team, that's guest access. That's different than, does that maybe simplify it a little bit more?
It's a good, it is really good explanation to help cover kind of the governance part of it. And so that's why I say, if somebody has governance questions, I'm going to shut up and let them ask, because the other part of it that I think it's around, if you're making calls, right? Is the expectation that they're going to be in your tenant versus their own tenant, and based on that, it would make a difference of how you chat with them, and and how you call them, because if you chat with them in a Teams post, they're gonna be only seeing those as emails unless they're sitting out in the other tenant, right? Versus they'll have more notifications by default. Obviously, you can change some of that, but anyway, I'll shut up and let people ask governance questions.
Well, those are great questions, but yeah, does anybody else have any other questions? I think we have, what, 9 minutes left. We have more time left than we did last time.
Did you have more questions last time?
We had less because we ran over in time.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Oh, gotcha. Okay. So you guys talked faster this time?
Less content.
Well, we
Gotcha.
tried to cram too much in the last time, I think.
Gotcha. Okay.
How about Don Muni from Unigroup? You have any questions, Don?
I'm listening. I'm good right now. Now
Okay.
This is being recorded. Do you guys have are we going to get access to this recording?
Yeah, I think Michelle, who's on here, is our marketing director. We've been recording these and publishing them out, I think, to our YouTube channel and then sending the link out. Is that how we're? Okay.
Okay, Michelle. Yeah. Okay. So when you send me a link for that, I can find the other ones that are previous to this then also?
Sure. Yep. I'll send you both.
Yes. And I think Cole is asking, no questions now, but if they have questions, who would be best to contact? Is there contact information you're providing also, Michelle?
Yes, I'll provide that.
Yeah, just
okay.
On in there. I was going to put it in the chat window, but if you want to send that as well, then please do. Yep.
Hey everybody, this is Steve Thomas from Covenant as well. I want to let you know that Scott, excuse me, Scott from our team has been doing customer immersion experiences or really hands-on user training at a lower level as well, as opposed to just strictly at the governance. So if you have a desire or a want for Scott Weinstein to get on board and do a presentation to your community, and we've been amazed by how simple the questions are sometimes, don't hesitate to ask. We'll be happy to get together with you.
Yeah, and actually, if you go out to the YouTube channel, some of those previous ones I think are posted there. But if you want to review one of those, but it's free of charge, and what that actually does is get your a team of your people into it and actually run through some true scenarios actively. So you're involved, you're following right through and joining and making calls or joining, and you're sharing things and doing it live with your team. So it helps give some hands-on, like you're saying, it's called CIE, which is Customer Immersion Experience. It's a great free session that you can sign up for.
And this is Rob. I have a question around that on CIEs. I doubt you've done this, but I'm going to ask anyway. As have you ever conducted any CIEs with where the role playing is with two organizations that are in two different tenants?
It kind of, because we're in one organization and you're in another. So when we do the immersion experience, it's similar to that. Like we would represent one organization and you are the other one. Now the difference there is going to be what we may allow and what the organization. Now what we can do is potentially work with you ahead of time to say, here's the limitations and things that we have to work with, and make sure that in the immersion experience, we account for those, and then say, we understand that you have these limitations, and here's what we would do to get around that, or here's how you can work this or communicate this to your end users.
Typically, when we have a true CIE, we don't have you use your tenant and we don't use our tenant.
That's been my experience.
Separate CIE tenant that we set up.
Right. So
everything works just perfectly.
Yeah. And
I was going to say, to add to that, I have done a presentation. It was O365 Teams user experience last year. A similar kind of thing where I simply set up a demo tenant to work all of that out, between myself and a demo tenant. So we could certainly, it's the same kind of thing, and we could incorporate some more of that into that.
Yeah. So if we understand ahead of time, we could potentially in these demo environments set the settings that mimic what your environment is, so that we get the better experience.
We've done many multi-client CIEs.
Really?
Yes.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, we used to open them up. We used to do them, I guess once a quarter, and they were always at Microsoft. Now, obviously, we'd have to do them virtually. But we used to do them quarterly at Microsoft, and we would invite all of our clients. And typically, you'd get like 5 or 6 from one company and 5 or 6 from another company, and then 1 or 2 other people, that would show up, and it worked out real well.
Yeah, I think that from a CIE experience, the first step would be to to have one with just the tech people, right, that manage the Office 365 environments, to help them understand how these things behave with each other, and then try to figure out how do we then get the right people from the different parts of the organization that are doing those collaborations across tenants to help them understand, because it's confusing based on the function of what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Nope. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, Scott, I may Rob, I may give you a yell about that.
Use the phone. We've got like a lot of people upstairs, so I can't hear when people yell all the time.
You betcha.
Thanks,
I was
Rob.
yelling out the window before, you didn't hear. I'm pretty loud. I will call you.
Perfect.
Any
Great.
more questions?
Anything else?
Even if you have a question that's not governance right now, we have a few more minutes. So if you have any question that that it's sitting in your mind that you want to ask, And like I said, if not, if after this you think about some things and questions pop up, we'll have our contact information provided to everyone that attended, and you can send us an email anytime you want. Great.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good day.
Appreciate it.
Stay safe.